Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 17th week of 2013. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news that's been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then asking our colleagues to comment on it. At the end, we'll have time for Coburn's Corner, where we'll nominate cliches, overused phrases, and tedious words for elimination. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20-some years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. So we're cablecasting from Neptune on the 26th of April, 2013. On this day, 45 years ago, 26 April 1968, a national student strike against the war involved as many as 1 million high school and college students across the United States. Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Chanted the students. Those strikers are my age, and I don't think they've been replaced. On that same day, 45 years ago, students at Columbia University occupied campus buildings. In the early morning hours 4 days later, the New York Police Department violently quashed the demonstrations and stormed the buildings, with approximately 132 students, 4 faculty members, and 12 police officers injured, and over 700 protesters arrested. So you're listening to News from Neptune, a B-A-R-A-C-K, How Many Kids Did You Kill Today edition. And we'll start with Ron Szoke on this day for presidential murders. Ron?
Well, I want to start at a somewhat different point concerning the strategy of the 1%, that is, those with the highest, the 1% of those with the highest incomes and wealth in this country, and point to the remarkable fact that they seem to be against transparency in certain respects, although calling for it in certain other respects. Mm-hmm. Tom Hartman points out that Republicans want to stop the Securities and Exchange Commission from adopting Rule 4637, which would require corporations to disclose their political contributions. A group of shareholder activists, pension fund representatives, and Democratic lawmakers are pushing the SEC to require corporations to report their political spending to investors. According to the New York Times, the agency is preparing for fierce opposition from corporations and lawmakers alike. So when is transparency called for, and when is it deemed intolerable? So in investigating Benghazi, there are a number of senators who are hot for transparency, but in other matters, looking into the financing of political campaigns and so on, campaign contributions, and agreements made with ex-legislators by the lobbying industry, we don't want so much transparency there. So how far are we gone in the direction of obscurity or the hiding of these influences and the corporate money that's going into politics? The Supreme Court telling us that they are persons and that the money that they're being given is speech, and we can't restrict their freedom of speech. Interesting column today in the New York Times by Paul Krugman about the demand for austerity and the Austerians, as he calls them, which is remarkably similar to the Austrians, I think, the so-called Austrian economics of von Mises and Hayek and its ultimate inspiration, but that would be controversial. Anyway.
Not that controversial.
Yeah. This recalls then another column in the New York Times, again, which has been getting kind of liberal recently. The Shadow Lobbyist by Thomas Edsall, saying that there's been a quiet upheaval in the lobbying industry, which of course is what it is. On the surface, the firms that represent thousands of businesses, trade associations, and special interests are taking a beating. In practice, however, the lobbying industry is moving below the radar, becoming less and less transparent. More than $3 billion is still spent annually, more of which is not being publicly disclosed. Corporate America is relying on new tactics to shape the legislative outcomes it wants. Indeed, it's been decided apparently by some corporations that if you have $1 million to spend on public relations or increasing profits, it's better to spend it influencing legislators than it is to improving your product or getting them greater acceptance. Edsall says the adoption of innovative practices by the influence industry, combined with legal reporting requirements that are full of loopholes, have created misleading indicators which suggest that there's been a decline in the clout of the lobbying sector. But again, it's one of those cases where by saying something that it's technically true in a sense, you can mislead completely. In fact, lobbying techniques have evolved so as to elude the regulations that implement the 1995 Lobbying Disclosure Act. These regulations are revised every 6 months in written guidance on LDA registration and recording requirements according to the Clerk of the House and the Secretary of the Senate. But there are, according to Edsall, arcane gaps in the law, certain loopholes that are big enough to drive massive loads of lobbying through and enormous amounts of money.
I wonder if it's the lobbyists who are lobbying the lobbying regulatory process.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
regulate me and let me do what I want. So
yeah, the influence industry there. Actually, if you look at the wealthiest locales, counties in America, they're clustered right around Washington, D.C., in the northern Virginia suburbs. And how did this come about? That that's the wealthiest area of the USA. Well, it's the home of a lot of high military people, lobbyists, and so on, who are all
defense
dependent on government for their wealth.
I just spent a week there.
Yeah.
Quite comfortable.
Yep. So, LA Times.
And it's got cherry blossoms.
Yeah. The wealth of nearly all Americans fell after the recession, except for the richest 7% of American families, which saw their average wealth soar 28% from 2009 to 2011, while the remaining households lost 4% of their net worth over the same period. So the report found that average wealth of the upper 7% of households jumped from 2.48 million to 3.17 million, thanks largely to the strengthening stock market. 6 out of 10 households with a net worth of $500,000 or more own stocks and mutual funds in 2011. This is another one of those misleading statistics that comes up very often. The number and the percentage of American households that have securities, stocks and bonds, owning them directly or indirectly through mutual funds. But we're not told how many of those households derive, let's say, 10% or more of their income or wealth from those supposed securities, because there are enormous numbers of small investors out there who don't have that much invested. Most of the wealth, the remaining 93%, has been tied up in homes, and the values plummeted both during and after the Great Recession, and only recently have been climbing. Only 13% of the households owned stocks and bonds, and their average wealth dipped to $133,000 from $139,000 over that same period that I've been talking about. So again, the finest flower of the propagandist's art is to say something that's technically true, taken sentence by sentence, but building a completely misleading structure out of that. So I refer you to Krugman's column today on the 1% solution, and maybe we'll come back to this, the slogans that are being used to support the position of these people, in particular the notion of balancing the budget, which apparently is thought to be a good thing to do, and the question is, what does that actually mean? So maybe we'll get back to that. Do you think we should balance the budget?
You got a take, David?
The technical news for this week has to do with something called the Rogoff-Reinhardt study. It's been reported on extensively by Krugman and by Dean Baker on his blog, cepr.net, and it's pretty much a slam dunk against this report that claimed that there was a negative relationship between percentage of GDP, debt as a percentage of GDP, and economic growth, meaning that when the percentage of the Rogoff-Reinhardt study allegedly showed that when national debt was more than 90% of GDP, then it would have a negative effect on growth. And it was hard to understand how you would even do a study like that, and it proved it was shown the study was very flawed, and I'm not even sure what the theoretical basis for that would be.
Wasn't it just a spreadsheet error?
It was more than that. It was selecting.
That was part of it, yeah, right.
It was selective of certain countries at certain times, but the basics of Keynesian, I'm not a worshiper of the whole Keynesian thing, but the basics of it have to do with the fact that that increased debt will increase demand. If increased debt reflects demand, then it will also spur growth, and this is the whole point that Krugman has been making, and Rogoff and Reinhardt have been sort of called to the carpet. They have two columns in the New York Times this morning. One defending themselves kind of defensively, and then the other kind of asserting their same view, and it's just stonewalling. And I think Dean Baker is right on top of this, as he usually is in this kind of domain.
Yeah, the tones of these columns are very interesting. I mean, it's last thing I want to do is shift from content to tone in regard to these guys. But the tones are so peculiar. Krugman is elegiac. Does anybody care about what I do? He sort of says, and the two. I mean, the R&R from Harvard, and that may be the best designation. They're as you say, David, remarkably defensive. And the best part of the whole thing is this argument that high debt is bad because it slows growth. In the midst of this article, they say, of course, the relationship may go the other way. It could go both ways. Yeah. Debt could go low. High debt could cause low growth, or low growth could cause high debt. I mean, this is incredible. The idea that the appearance of an intellectual argument here turns out to be almost less interesting than the tone in which it's conducted, because it becomes clear that the R&R argument is a setup for propaganda. We've got to cut the deficit, and therefore we can't do any things that we should be doing, like providing jobs.
Krugman closes in this kind of despairing note, I believe that ideas and evidence matter, at least a bit. Otherwise, what am I doing with my life?
Oh, poor Paul.
But I guess we'll see just how much cynicism is justified. So.
It's just incredible. I mean,
what the R&R people, and this is a woman named Carmen Reinhardt and a man named Kenneth Rogoff, what they're doing is kind of claiming that they're innocent. They're innocent researchers just doing the best they can to describe reality, and somebody may have made too much out of their the Austerians may have made too much out of their argument for their taste, now that they've been called on the carpet for doing so. But from what I understand, they weren't notable for trying to counteract any of the uses of their argument. The only small bit of defense I can think of to mitigate the criticism of this is that I'm sure that even without the study, there would be the austerity argument. Nobody's saying that austerity comes out of this. It comes out of, if it has to come out of a theoretical context, it comes out of the whole, so sort of the common sense, the perverse common sense argument that debts are bad and that debts can't increase indefinitely over time and have a healthy economy, and there's a certain common sense aspect to that, but it doesn't really apply during times of recession and depression. So they didn't create austerity, but they've enabled it in certain ways, and now they're claiming that they don't.
But the response has been that most of the endorsement of their view has been really on a moralistic basis, that we have living too high on the hog.
Yeah,
and,
that's it. Yes.
We now have to suffer the consequences of that.
Tell that to people who've just lost their houses,
or
their jobs, or whose wages have been flat for 30 years, as in fact they have. Hey, you got to take this because things were too good for you before. I mean this is quite remarkable.
So we have sinned, and we must pay the penalty, or at least those people must.
We hear less of that, I think, in this country than that's been part of the European argument, particularly in Britain, but also, the Germans have been saying, "Oh, you profligate Southerners," to the Spaniards and the Greeks and the Italians, and now it's time for you to pay, and by the way, pay us. So it's I think you started at the right place, Ron, the strategy of the 1%. And it may be worthwhile for us to point out that, the strategy of the 1% has a name. And it's a name that puts us in the context of policies and practices that are not just a matter of several months or several years old, but really a generation old. The name's neoliberalism. The strategy of the 1% is neoliberalism. And the minute we begin to talk about that, we're supplying the missing piece, I think, for what actually is going on in the American economy and has been for more than a generation. It's only becoming clear now as we find intellectuals like R&R who were doing the propaganda work for the 1% have their situation actually called into question. A notable hedge fund manager this week said, "Oh, okay, it's time to get rid of austerity." I think the reason is largely that the point of diminishing returns on austerity as a policy in both Europe and the U.S. is becoming clear. So now you've got dexterously to move away and find some other way to mask the neoliberal policy. I'm worried about what it might be. Within the last week, the New York Times has come out against the Guantanamo horror that the Obama administration has produced, and the Washington Post has come out against the drone horror that the Obama administration had produced. Ron came into the program today with an ad in the student paper for a group of student Republicans and Democrats calling for support for Israel against the threat of Iran and Iran's nuclear weapons itself, as we've talked about here before, a complete construct, a propaganda construct. I'm worried that the new distraction that the government will find will be new war. More war. Things are tough. Yes, that's right. But hey, look, there's a war on. We've got to invade Syria. It's really important. Otherwise, those guys will get nuclear weapons.
Well, we need a new set of slogans. And, what will it be? The use of weapons of mass destruction by the Syrians.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Hey, there's evidence they're using sarin gas.
Yes.
So, and this coming, remember how important it was that Chuck Hagel become defense secretary because he was a liberal and he was going to mitigate the rush to war of the Obama administration? Well, guess who's leading the rush to war in the Obama administration? Rush to war is not quite right. What the Obama administration has been doing has been sort of titrating war all along here. They use the threat of war both for their Middle Eastern policy, which is basically the control over the passage of oil and gas through the Middle East, and also to distract the American public, which should be calling for massive government activity to improve the economy. And should be going on in Europe too, but the Obama administration has been able to snake hip its way through those demands, or rather to see that those demands aren't there much at all, by saying, "Look, we've got to fight terrorism." So yeah, these things are bound up together, I'm afraid. You're listening to News from Neptune. And we are moving on. David, you want to move on to something else? Or
well, I'm going to basically open up the same vein and bleed a little more out of that.
We all are.
I'll in passing mention, going back to the lobbying issue, it's, as I'm sure you know, is obvious that neither party is free of this. And there was an interesting article by the co-editor of Counterpunch, Joshua Frank, about his long-term relationship with Senator Max Baucus from Montana regarding discovering the lobbying creature, the lobbied creature that Max Baucus is. And Tom Daschle was also another, when he was a powerful senator from South Dakota. I don't know what it is about these small states that creates lobbyists or people, the Democratic leadership, that are so amenable to the so-called special interest groups, but there's a couple of examples there that are well known, especially in relation to health care. But going back to the previous issue, there seems to be sort of a critical mass of fear that is, I think Carl is sort of getting at here, of gets to the point of who do we need to bomb next, or who do we need to supply with military arms next, or who do we need to invade next. I think that the Boston Marathon bombings have obviously contributed to this, and they've also contributed to I think, a real debate among the anti-war left and right, libertarian right, of course, regarding how we think about the Boston Marathon bombing in terms of geopolitics. Justin Raimondo at antiwar.net, which is a libertarian anti-war website, is really putting forth the idea that there really is a conspiracy involved here, or that the Tsarnaev brothers could not possibly have done this without some help from that part of the world, or from jihadists in some way, or some network. And I think that, you know, he's raised the possibility that there may be a conspiracy here, and that there may be a conspiracy theory here, and there may be a conspiracy theory that has to be taken seriously at some point. I don't know. I think on the other end of the spectrum, of the anti-war spectrum anyway, I know, Carl, you mentioned last week, and I've heard elsewhere, the idea that this is more of a Columbine type attack. These are two alienated young men, and given, you know, the trips back and forth to Russia or to Dagestan and so forth, and the circumstances of all this, and the context of this, you know, whatever the reality of it, I think the geopolitical context of it has to be taken seriously. Whatever the direct relationship between their behavior and their background and their motives, the idea of blowback still has to be taken quite seriously. We've been supporting jihadists. We started just supporting jihadists or mujahideen Afghanistan, in Pakistan and Afghanistan, when the Soviets invaded
Before
Afghanistan,
that.
even before that.
Yeah, right.
And the results of that have to do with our supporting Muslim extremists in Bosnia and Kosovo and Sudan and other places like that. And this, at some general level, this is blowback. It's blowback from the fall of the Soviet Union and Russia's attempts to deal with partly Islamic-inspired rebellion in their own territories, and the complicated relationships there between the U.S. and Russia and our governments, as Justin Raimondo points out, our support for Chechen rebellion. So you get all these sort of ironic, convoluted relationships where it may have been somewhat official policy to at least oppose Russia's suppression of Chechens, and that may be the Russians' treatment have certainly been reprehensible, but that doesn't speak to our motives for doing that, and beyond that, it doesn't speak to the consequences of people like the Tsarnaevs being in an environment, in a political environment, insofar as they were, that may have inspired them against U.S. foreign policy in ways that go back to the sort of understandable, at some level, ways that Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden was opposed to U.S. foreign policy. So ultimately, this has to be seen in the context of long-term interventions in various aspects of the Muslim world, our exploitation of Islamic radicalism and our opposition to Islamic radicalism, depending on what our government perceives as its geopolitical goals in that region related to oil or whatever. So these are complicated issues, and I don't think they will go away. I mean, certainly the media will not sort them out at this level. The media is looking for, the mainstream media is looking for justifications for the continued global war on terror. And George W. Bush is being lionized this week in the mainstream media for being
not being president.
For what?
For not being president.
Right,
that's right. We don't have to talk about the current problems because we can always say, hey, look, there's George.
Yeah. So I'm just laying it out all there to see that I think there's an interesting debate and complicated debate, even as I said at the start, within those who are critical of the U.S.'s war-making policies. And it will be interesting to see what the reality comes to be and what the tactics come to be for opposing U.S. foreign policy, because we have to make the same we have to make a different argument out of the same reality. If there is a jihadist involvement in this or a Al-Qaeda involvement in this, we have to take that and counter the sort of global war on terror approach that the mainstream will take.
You got a take, Ron, on conspiracy
Yes,
in my old neighborhood in Boston?
Well, it's interesting that you seem to be saying, in a sense, something along the lines of what Richard Falk was saying. And that got
And look what it got him.
Yeah, it got him denounced and
By Susan Rice.
demands that the United Nations fire him.
Yeah.
So here's the article. A top U.S. official called Wednesday for the United Nations to fire a human rights advocate who implied that the Boston Marathon bombing was payback for America's geopolitical fantasy of global domination and its friendship with Israel. Quoting, outraged by Richard Falk's highly offensive Boston comments, someone who spews such vitriol has no place at the UN. Past time for him to go, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, told Twitter.
Awful Susan Rice.
Yeah. So Falk said the American Global Domination Project is bound to generate all kinds of resistance in the post-colonial world, Falk said. We should be asking ourselves at this moment how many canaries will have to die before we awaken from our geopolitical fantasy of global domination. So
I'll point out the last person who said that was Ron Paul, and look what happened to him.
Yeah, right. So, fire this guy. He's saying wrong things.
Exactly.
And how different is that from what you were saying, David?
Not too different. He probably put it more succinctly than I did.
Yeah.
Well, and was it the last time, as a UN official, he attempted to go to the occupied territories? Israel turfed him out as fast as they turfed out Chomsky. Yeah, I mean, you know. So, yeah, I mean, this is the UN official, and therefore, naturally, he has to be denounced by the U.S. UN ambassador, Susan Rice. There is, in the midst of this, gentlemen, it seems to me, one clearly conspiratorial group that, to my surprise, we haven't mentioned yet, and that they're the ones, I think, in some ways, some of the investigation should be directed to, and it's clear that the American press doesn't want to do it. I mean, of course, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I mean, if we look at what the FBI has actually done since 9/11, we have this appalling record of the FBI going out and finding weird guys, you know, often half-intelligent guys whom they, the FBI, can then set up as conspirators by giving them guns, money, setting them up, saying, why wouldn't it be a good idea to have some sort of demonstration against American policy, you guys? I mean, entrapment, yes, but not just entrapment in the sense of trying to get some criminal to commit an act which he can then be prosecuted for, but precisely the entrapment of these half-intelligent folks into a plot which the FBI can then bust and say, look what we're doing, we're stopping terrorism. Here's a terrorism plot that we've busted it. Now, the suggestion that the Tsarnaevs may have been guys like that and may have been victims of the FBI is just a suggestion. We don't have evidence of that, as far as I know. But we do have evidence of the FBI being involved with this business from the beginning, and they're using this peculiar Blackwater-type group, Kraft International, at the Boston Marathon itself, and having the National Guard ready to move into Boston. I mean, you know, wait a minute. You know, a lot of things were going on here, and they may all be justified in terms of the FBI trying to keep us safe from terrorism. On the other hand, if we look at what the FBI has been doing, it seems we should at least be asking about what they were doing around this whole mishigas. You know, there's the conspiracy. They're the people, known conspirators, who were involved in what went down in Boston.
Yeah, and I think the mainstream media is. It'll be interesting to see if there's any activity in the mainstream media. I mean, certainly there's some people who want to know the truth about what they knew about these guys and what they did or didn't do.
Right.
And the question is, how will that push up against the limits of the mainstream narrative, if you will, of the fact that the FBI is just protecting us with everything they do, because there's been relatively little criticism in the mainstream media of this whole sting mentality, this whole informant mentality that the FBI has so almost exclusively relied on in the midst of missing, you know, some of the major actual threats in the last 11, 12 years. So you know, you can never expect that the mainstream media is going to buy into the context of blowback, but you would think that they would have to at least approach the actual evidence of what they knew about these guys and what they did or didn't do.
Yes, indeed. You're watching News from Neptune. We have a whole list of things to cover. I want to talk about an aspect of this of the current situation that touches on some of the points that Ron made early on, but shifts the focus a little from the U.S. to Europe, and particularly to Italy. I've been really quite appalled at the way Italian politics have been treated in the American media for a long time. But recently, since the Italian election several months ago, it seems to me the coverage has been particularly bad, and the reason it's been bad, it's not innocent. The reason it's bad is that the coverage, an accurate coverage of Italian politics would raise serious questions about the austerity program in Europe and, by implication, the austerity program in this country. Therefore, the media don't give a good account of it because it's exactly those questions that the media, at the behest of the administration, don't want raised. I mean, I think if there's anyone around to write the history of the Obama administration sometime, one of the things they'll note is the peculiar commitment of the Obama administration to make sure that popular criticism of their military policy and popular criticism of their economic policy not arise. They've been very good at it. I've pointed out before that in Obama's pre-presidential book, The Audacity of Hope, he analyzes the Vietnam War opposition in these terms and suggests how important it is that that not happen again. So in this day when we remember popular opposition to the Vietnam War 45 years ago, it may be interesting to note that the Obama administration is very good at preventing popular opposition to its policies, which are the policies of the 1%, as Ron described it, preventing that from occurring. And that, by a roundabout way, is the reason you have not, the reason you get this picture of Italian politics as being a lot of sort of crazy guys who can't get it together. That's the narrative that we get from the media. You got Berlusconi there, who, after all, has a taste for young women, you know, and therefore he's a bad guy. You've got Beppe Grillo, who's a comedian. My God, the man's a television comedian. What's he doing in politics? And obviously he hasn't a clue, and he's just fouling things up. He's keeping Italian politics from getting it together. Well, that narrative is, as I say, not an innocent narrative, I think. It's a way of getting rid of a very real movement against austerity in the Italian politics. Point one, Berlusconi is not stupid. Whatever else you say about his motives and morals and whatnot, he is a clever politician. And in fact, he did very well in this last election precisely by embracing the anti-austerity position. Now, the party that should have embraced the anti-austerity position had failed to do so. The PD, the Democratic Party, as they call it there, it actually has some similarities, you know, to the Democrats in the U.S. It's in fact the residue of the old left in Italy. But the PD and their leader didn't have the guts or the smarts to oppose the austerity program, and Berlusconi stole their clothes. Triangulation in a Clintonian fashion, you know. And as a result, his party did better than they were expected to. They're sort of the analog to the Republican Party in this country, you might say. And the Democratic Party essentially destroyed itself. Its leader just resigned this last week, and it's fallen into pieces. And the insurgent movement, led by this television comedian, did very well indeed because it was also anti-austerity. So the lines were sort of upside down in a left-right paradigm here, you know. But the first thing one does when one thinks seriously about politics is discard the left-right paradigm, right? The results this weekend raises other questions about the austerity issue. The constitution of the Italian Republic is peculiar, but it means that the upshot was the 87-year-old president of the Republic, a ceremonial post, but with some constitutional work to do, was maintained in office for a second term, and has produced a government that's a grand coalition of their Republican and Democrat parties, if you like, under the direction of a new man, a young man in his 40s, and the first thing he does as he steps forward is say, okay, austerity has to end. So the peculiarity is that the old parties are back in place, but they have understood that the austerity regime has got to be mitigated. Now, what that means, how much they're still going to have to play ball with the German bankers is difficult to say. But the opposition now is a peculiar conjunction of elements of the old left party, the real left parts of the old left party, and that television comedian, Beppe Grillo. Grillo in Italian means cricket. And so the Greens, if you might say, or the third party group, are called the Grillini in Italy, the crickets, if you like. But there is a new conjunction, in other words, of opposition here. The upshot of the thing we should learn from this, from a good account of these Italian politics, is the move against austerity. And when we have even hedge fund managers in America saying, okay, austerity has run its course, it's time that the opposition to the economic policies of the Obama government, like the opposition to the economic policies of the Italian government, come to the fore. And, there may indeed be a European-American spring here in the economy. Do you think so, gentlemen?
I'm not sure. Doesn't the slogan "balance the budget" still have enormous popularity?
Well, that's why Rogoff and that's why R&R have got the purchase they do, so to speak.
How much of this is attributed to? I mean, Italy is a big player in the European Union.
Yep.
It has to be taken more seriously than Greece and perhaps Spain. I'm not sure, relative what its economy is relative to Spain, but Italy must be perceived as more of a threat to the consensus, to the sort of the German-French consensus.
I think
if there is such a thing.
That might be right. I mean, they've neutralized Hollande in France. Hollande came in actually as an anti-austerity candidate as president and has been completely spun around on that point. Unemployment hit 25% in Spain. It's nowhere near so high in Italy, although Italy is certainly suffering. Youth unemployment may be 60% in Spain. I mean, I think there's some worry in a lot of parts that this really may become a popular movement, a revolutionary movement. They're talking about revolution in the French papers. The French papers had a picture of President Hollande dressed as Louis XIV. Their headlines in the French papers, is this 1789? Is this what's going on? So I think what we're seeing here is a real worry on the part of our rulers, on the part of the 1%, that popular opposition may in fact emerge, and therefore something has to be done to make nice.
I have to say, in my reading, I don't direct myself towards Italy, and so this is coming as relative news to me, but it's interesting that there don't seem to be articles on the main sort of leftist portal websites that really have, unless I've missed them or perhaps
no, I think it's been badly covered there too.
Yeah, I don't think it's really on the. I think what's going on in Italy is on the front burner of given given the more violent nature of politics in so many parts of the world, given the interest in Latin America. Italy's has kind of fallen through the cracks in the leftist consciousness, I guess, except for those who more seek it out, or go to the more specific sites that deal with it.
There's some interesting figures emerging there. I mean, the ally in opposition to the television, to the Grillini, is a fellow called Nicky Vendola, who is president or governor of the Puglia region. It's the heel of the boot, if you like, in Italy. And is a very interesting fellow. He heads something called the Socialist Equality and Liberty Party. And he's a gay Catholic, ex-communist or communist. He's not a member of the Communist Party anymore, because the Communist Party in Italy has disappeared. There's a brilliant new book called The Tailor of Ulm about the history of Italian communism up to the moment it produces probably the most interesting young politician in Italy, that is Nicky Vendola. So, we may hear more about that in days to come. We are coming to the last few minutes of News from Neptune. We have a couple of minutes, perhaps, for Coburn's Corner. You got a candidate for Coburn's Corner, language that should be sent to the guillotine, Ron?
Yes, I have two terms.
Okay, good.
Fashionable and trendy.
Good. My, how fashionable, how trendy of you. Yes.
So, these are supposed to be indicators of some stigma or trying to stigmatize someone else's views as fashionable or trendy. So are your views fashionable or trendy? Are mine? Please tell me.
A glass of fashion, David Green. What do you think?
Do you want me to put in my entry for
Yeah,
this
sure,
week?
sure.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
yeah. While we're being fashionable
While
and
we're
trendy.
being, well, you know, I referred before to the you know, the self-love fest that has been going on down in Texas this week with the opening of the George W.
Yes.
Bush
Oh, dear, yes.
Presidential Library. And there are many things that have to be said about that, or should be said about that, or perhaps not said about that. But the media has gone along hook, line, and sinker with, if there's ever, you know, if there's ever any doubt as to what the two-party system is really like in this country, the idea that they don't have to pretend to like each other; they have to pretend to hate each other. You know, is my take on it. Clinton. It turns out Clinton and Bush love each other.
Yeah, sure.
And they're apparently talking dirty on the phone to each other, and
What a
or
surprise.
something like that. And Hillary is yucking it up in the background, but out of this comes the term "history will be the judge."
Yeah. Oh, dear God.
that,
Here we go. Okay, yes. Yes.
History will be the judge. If you read Charles Krauthammer's even more wretched than you could possibly imagine column in the paper this morning, whether in the Washington Post or in our local paper, you will see the worst sort of aspects of the history will be the judge, that just as Ronald Reagan in retrospect, you know, is understood or just as Harry Truman's fighting of the Korean War can now be understood in the context of the larger Cold War and its contribution towards winning the Cold War, so will George W. Bush be judged in terms of his contribution to the war on terror, the war against Islamic radicalism, and so forth.
Yeah, Fidel Castro said, "History will absolve me." That's what they all say. Some are saying that about Hitler and Stalin as well. So
But of course,
they were
yeah.
misunderstood.
I mean, it needs to be said, if it isn't obvious, that history is no such thing. History is always written by human beings.
And the winners, they say, right?
And the winners. And
Yes.
of course, I support the kind of history that's written by people like Howard Zinn,
Right.
that don't pretend to take a quote-unquote objective view or sort of an amoral view of history. But you know, in any event, that seems to be one of the last refuge of these particular scoundrels is, given the unpopularity of the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, that we fast forward to 50 years from now, when nobody will know very much about these things, but since we are supposed to idolize and lionize all presidents as being these special human beings who sort of carry this historical destiny with them, that George Bush will be, he will be seen as I think as Krauthammer put it, prescient, practical and prescient in his support of these
Remarkably,
wars.
there's even been attempts to rehabilitate to some extent Calvin Coolidge recently.
But yes, a horrible woman named Amity Shlaes, who
Yes.
keeps writing bad books about bad presidents,
But
in that case.
But to have a good account of American economic history in the 20th century, an accurate account, an account that talks about the real interest, it talks about with the point that Ron started with today, the strategy of the 1% in the 1920s, in the Coolidge regime, that would be very valuable. In George Orwell's famous dystopian novel, the protagonist works for the Ministry of Truth. And the Ministry of Truth is primarily a historical institute. Their job is to write the story of the past in such a way that it justifies the policy of the government at the moment. And this was seen as, peculiar when Orwell wrote his novel. But the protagonist works in a department whose motto is, who controls the past controls the future. In other words, if you can say how we got here and what the parties were and so forth, you know, then you can control where we're going. And he who controls the present, they say, controls the past. So his job is to go through and cut out inappropriate things and make sure it goes down the memory hole. That's where we get the phrase, the memory hole, things we need to forget about. We need to forget about the policy of the 1% in the 1920s, the policy of the weapons makers that led to World War I, the policy of the New York bankers that Woodrow Wilson was working for in order to involve the United States in the European War. These things have to go down the memory hole. They have to be forgotten. Americans don't know that. And when something like, you mentioned Oliver Stone's television series comes along and begins to remind people of aspects of this past, why Stone is attacked as a conspiratorialist, right?
Yeah, I just wish Stone, I like Stone, except I wish he'd get off the Kennedy thing, off the JFK thing. He really he subscribes to the false notion that things would have been different, you know, that somehow, you know, that he was going to get us out of Vietnam and so forth. So
hey,
I think he goes wrong there.
History will be the judge, right?
Yes.
You have been watching News from Neptune for the 17th week of 2013. For this program and others are available on YouTube, thanks to Caleb, and we have a series that will continue to post on our Facebook page, and when I get around to doing it, on our website. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky, and this has been our BARACK, How Many Kids Did You Kill Today edition. If this program has interested you, you might want to see others here on Urbana Public Television, now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. You may be watching this online now. Particularly Democracy Now! Every weekday morning at 7 a.m. and The Big Picture every weekday morning at 8 a.m. Other special programs through the week. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been David Green and Ron Szoke. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to you, PTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.